During World War II, the battlefield wasn't only in Europe or the Pacific, it was also in backyards, city blocks, and abandoned lots. As nations faced food shortages, civilians were encouraged to grow their own produce in what became known as victory gardens. But here's the strange part of history. Many of the gardening methods developed during that time have quietly faded away, even though they were remarkably effective at growing large amounts of food in very small spaces. On today's episode of Strange History, we're uncovering 7 forgotten World War II gardening tricks that helped ordinary people produce incredible harvests under some of the toughest conditions in modern history. The first trick is intercropping, also known as companion planting. Instead of planting crops in neat rows of the same vegetable, World War II gardeners often mixed different plants together in the same plot. A classic example was planting beans alongside corn and squash. The corn acted as a natural trellis. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to fertilize the corn, and the squash spread along the ground to prevent weeds and lock in moisture. This method meant that 3 crops could grow in the space normally used for one. It's a technique as old as indigenous agriculture, but was revived and promoted during the war as a way to stretch every square foot of soil to its maximum potential. So the second trick is vertical gardening with trellises and makeshift supports. With land at a premium, especially in cities, people actually turned walls, fences, and even old bomb shelters into growing space. Beans, cucumbers, peas, and even tomatoes were encouraged to climb upward rather than, just sprawl on the ground. Families would nail chicken wire to wooden frames or, sometimes, repurpose war scrap like old bed frames into climbing structures. By growing vertically, people could harvest pounds of vegetables from areas no larger than a single doorway. It really transformed narrow alleys, balconies, and rooftops into miniature farms. The third forgotten method is succession planting, which basically meant never leaving soil bare. As soon as one crop was harvested, another was immediately planted in its place. For example, once early lettuce was picked, gardeners would quickly sow beans or carrots in the same space. This constant cycling meant that small gardens could produce food for months at a time without pause. During World War II, agricultural pamphlets stressed the importance of no idle soil, a rule that made tiny gardens far more productive than most modern ones. Today, many home gardeners plant just once a season and, miss out on the extra yields this old method provides. The fourth technique is intensive spacing, sometimes called square-foot gardening today, but widely used during the war years. Instead of long rows with wide paths, crops were packed tightly into raised beds or small boxes. Seeds were sown close together in grids so that plants grew just far enough apart to mature without wasting any soil space. Leafy greens like spinach, kale, and chard thrived in these dense plantings. Not only did this method increase harvests, but it also shaded the soil, keeping weeds down and reducing the need for watering, an important factor when resources were rationed. The fifth forgotten trick is using trench composting right in the garden beds. Compost bins were a luxury many families didn't have, so people dug trenches between their rows and buried kitchen scraps, grass clippings, and even shredded paper directly in the soil. As the waste broke down, it enriched the earth with nutrients right where the plants needed it. This cut down on fertilizer needs and reduced household waste at a time when nothing could be spared. In some cases, families rotated their trench lines each year, gradually improving the entire garden with rich organic matter. It was a closed-loop system that made the most out of what little they had. The sixth trick is using cold frames and cloches to extend the growing season. Made from old windows, scrap wood, or even clear glass jars, these miniature greenhouses allowed people to start seeds earlier in spring and keep harvesting later into the fall. Cold frames were especially popular in Britain, where the climate limited year-round food supply. A pane of glass over a lettuce bed could add weeks of growing time, ensuring fresh produce when rations were tight. What's fascinating is that these simple DIY devices often outperformed modern store-bought gardening gadgets, yet few people use them today. The seventh and final World War II gardening trick is communal land sharing and allotment systems. Governments actively encouraged citizens to transform public spaces into gardens. Schoolyards, church lawns, factory grounds, and even parts of city parks were dug up and planted. In Britain, people famously grew vegetables in royal parks and on the lawns outside the Tower of London. In the United States, vacant lots and rooftops were turned into food plots. Neighbors often shared tools, seeds, and harvests, making the most of land that would otherwise sit unused. This collective effort didn't just produce food, it created a sense of resilience and unity in the face of wartime hardship. When we look back at these 7 forgotten gardening methods, it's striking how relevant they are today. With rising food costs, shrinking yard sizes, and growing interest in sustainable living, the solutions invented during the Second World War might be exactly what modern gardeners need to revisit. Intercropping, vertical gardening, succession planting, intensive spacing, trench composting, season extension, and communal gardening were not just wartime measures. They were creative, resourceful, and honestly, surprisingly efficient strategies for producing food under pressure. History often hides its most practical lessons in plain sight. The Victory Garden movement may have been born out of necessity, but it left behind a blueprint for resilience that still applies in the 21st century. If you have even the smallest patch of soil, a balcony, or a shared community space, these old tricks can help you turn it into a thriving source of fresh food. And perhaps, like those gardeners of the 1940s, we can find strength and hope in the simple act of planting seeds, even in uncertain times. This has been Strange History, where we uncover the hidden and unusual stories of the past. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten World War II gardening hacks, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so more people can rediscover the wisdom of the past. Who knows? Maybe your own backyard could become the next Victory Garden.